Okay, let's take a look at the beam tool next. So looking at my floor plan, again showing the trace reference below for these porch beams, understanding where things are positioned in ArchiCAD, what the home story is, not just the vertical placement, um, makes it a lot easier to adjust these things with sort of global changes. I call it future-proofing the model. So for example, if the beam tool, I want to place these porch beams, they might need to be visible on the story below, but by placing them as this being their home story, the floor above, the roof story or second floor, or whatever it is, means that any floor-to-floor changes in the story settings, these beams adjust with it. So if I look at the beam tool, similar to the wall tool, I have single element, multi-beam segments. You can do a rectangular placement or rotated rectangle placement, or an arced or curved beam. Just like with the wall, when I start to place a segmented beam, I get the option to place that as a curve. So you don't really need this curved geometry method. But in this case, I want to take a look at the beam settings and set it up to be these porch beams. So we'll take a look at modeling the porch beams and modeling the rafters using the beam tool. We'll start by putting it on beams visible as the layer. We're going to set the segment here, we'll start kind of backwards, as a rectangular segment. And this will be wood framing as the profile, and let's go ahead and make that, maybe it's an 8x10 beam. Just like with the column, you can segment this out, so you can have multiple segments so that it doesn't necessarily have a consistent profile. I can go back to just the basic segment. It can also taper, so you can have it taper at one end versus the other, which is really useful for things like rafters and custom rafter tails. The profile can be rectangular, round, or the custom profile. And again, that's any drafted shape extruded along that reference. The beam reference, similar to the column, is defined as top of beam, center of beam, bottom of beam, or any of the four corners or midpoints. You can also have a horizontal axis offset, where you can offset it from the center or from the corner. Can be useful for things like crown molding or base molding. And again, placing this, if it's a baseboard, for example, so that the reference line is in the bottom inside corner, means that as the baseboard grows or shrinks, it grows and shrinks from the wall finish outward. In this case, I'm modeling the porch columns centered up on that beam. Just like the walls, there's a junction order here, so when you have multiple elements coming together, you can establish what order they join together in. So I have this 8x10 beam. I'm going to use that as my porch beam. To project 0, I can set this to be 10 feet to start with, so it's at 0 to home story. I also have a floor plan setting, so just like with the other things, I can say what stories this shows on. So if I say home story and 1 story down, I'm going to be able to see this below. And then I have outlines and hidden lines. I can say that these show up dashed below the current story. And I have the ability to set the pens for this, so not mechanical pens, probably structural for the cut pens, and we'll set those here. Beam ends can be shown or not. Cover fill can be added to the beams. I'm going to show this with projected and overhead so that it shows as overhead below the current story. Now when I draw this out, and again, don't forget about classification and properties, setting this as a beam. Let's go ahead and throw that in here. Say OK. Now when I draw this out, I can start by drawing it to the center line of that column, for example. And I'm just going to snap this all the way around. Something like that. And because it was set to home story and 1 story below, if I turn my trace reference off and drop below this story, I should see it with dashed lines there. And what that means is that when the story settings change, that beam is going to move up with the story below. I can come in here and refine where that sits by clicking on it here and adjusting it in 3D. So if I know that it needs to sit down 8 3/4 inches, something like that, I can refine it. in 3D, and it doesn't change its position associated to that story above because its home story is the second floor, or what would be the roof story. Now if I have a rafter beam, for example, let's go ahead and copy this. I'm just dragging a copy of this over, and let's show above current story. And I'm going to take this beam and stretch it out to the eave. And generally speaking, you get one beam set and use that as sort of the graphic favorite or the preset favorite. So here I can stretch this beam out, and from here I'm just going to edit it primarily in section view. So I'm going to open this section cutting straight through the middle of that beam. Here I can see exactly where that sits, so if I grab that beam and drag that down so that it lines up with the face of finish right there, I can then take my, zoom in here, I can take my guidelines and snap a guideline to the underside of that roof so that when I grab this beam and adjust the slope to align to that roof, I'm snapping directly to that. And then here I can see that horizontally offset out, I'm 3 foot 11 and 7/8 because of that kickback on that roof edge. And what I can do is set that rafter tail to be separate from the beam itself. So coming into the segment, I can establish a segment and say I'm going to add a segment. This lower segment, oh, that's the upper segment. The lower segment here is going to be a fixed length. We'll just make that 3 feet. And then that'll taper down. So from here, I can say that that end is, let's say, 5.5 inches. Oh, that's backwards. It's always a guess and check on which end is the start and which end is the end. So now when I say OK, I'm going to see that rafter profile pop up right here, exactly where it needs to be. You do have options for adjusting with the pet palette what the cut angle of these things are. So if that needed to be vertical with a notch, that's also doable. I do not think that there's a cut depth, so it may be a guess and check on aligning that exact cut angle. But I think that this is pretty close to what the practice model shows. So now if I need to bird's mouth that out, I can pull this beam up to that exact position. And then when I go to my 3D model, right, this beam is higher. I can eyedrop and inject that beam into these other beam pieces. If I grab all of my columns now and stretch those, they should all stretch together to snap back to place there. So now I have one beam set, and I can use the multiply commands to array those around the building. Get its position set horizontally, maybe it's off the corner here, and use the multiply command. Let's go ahead and say that these are 32 inches on center, or whatever they need to be there, and multiply that to the corner where this hip would be coming off. So that is a couple of functions of the beam tool for horizontal beams and for rafter tails.